Hello and welcome to our second Transforming Indigenous Emergency Response webinar. And this is part of a series hosted by the International Indigenous Health Research and Training Center. My name is Warwick Byges, and I'm a project manager with the IIHRTC based out of Saskatoon, and will be hosting today with the help from my colleague, Alison Pichet. Thank you for taking time out of your day to join us. We're excited to have you all here to hear from Michelle. As we gather virtually here today, I want to acknowledge that I'm on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. I've lived in Saskatoon for nearly a decade and am privileged to live on the lands and work with people in Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 and beyond. I pay my respect to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. And I'll invite you in the chat to share your affiliation, where you're joining from, and which territories you are in, and also to take a moment to reflect on your relationship to the land, to those who came before us, and to those who will follow. And for those of you who were not here at the first webinar, this is part of a project called Transforming Emergency Response in First Nations and Métis communities in the times of COVID-19 through gender and cultural safety. The project is led by Dr. Caroline Tate, a medical anthropologist in the psychiatry department at the University of Saskatchewan, and also a member of the Métis Nation Saskatchewan, and Dr. Simon Lambert, an associate professor in the Indigenous Studies department at the University of Saskatchewan, and Maori from Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I know I still slaughtered that. I'm sorry, Simon. So we are grateful for funding from TD Bank Group's TD Ready Challenge. And as you can see on the slide there are a number of activities that are included in this project. And if you'd like to learn more about what we're doing and what we're up to, we will have some links to our webpage in the chat. And with that out of the way, I'll invite Dr. Caroline Tate to share some words of welcome.
Yeah, so welcome everybody, and thanks for joining us today in what seems like the middle of winter, when in fact I think we're headed towards spring, but it's very cold in Saskatchewan. It's I think -20 here today or more. But I am also on Treaty 6. I'm up in our homeland, Métis homeland, up a little bit further north of Prince Albert. And I'm so excited to hear Michelle speak today. This is a very, very important presentation today. And just so you know, I'm dealing with my own have dealt with my own terrible at-risk management, and had a bit of a disaster this week where I dropped a bowl of chili, and so I have actually a burnt forehead from having chili come all over top of me. So I had my own natural disaster this week in my house, and that. So we were just laughing about about how clumsy you get as you get as I'm getting older. I'm getting clumsier, but I'm very happy to have people here. And one of the things I would like to say before we get started is that if anyone here who's joining today has any suggestions for webinars of people that you think would be great guests and that you'd like to hear a webinar from, either from Saskatchewan or Canada or internationally, please send us, I think we'll have a link at the end. Please send us your suggestions, because it's really meant to be that way. I am listed as the lead, but I'm actually not an expert in this area. So it's really Warwick and Simon that are leading much more than I am, and I'm here mostly to learn in that. So I really am very, very happy to have everyone here, and I'll turn it back to Warwick to introduce Michelle. Thank you.
Thanks, Caroline. So before we begin, I will introduce Michelle and just have a quick little note about the webinar format. So Michelle is currently the Associate Director for Saskatchewan First Nation Emergency Management, based out of Prince Albert, Saskatchewan. She's also the President of the Aboriginal Firefighters Association of Canada. Michelle began her career as a volunteer firefighter in her home community of Muscadet First Nation and has been active in their fire department for 21 years, making her the longest serving female firefighter and the first female captain in the department's history. Aside from training and fire response, Michelle has been an advocate for change in how fire services are delivered on reserve and will be sharing her experiences and progress in her work in Saskatchewan. So on behalf of everyone here, thank you for being with us today, Michelle. After the presentation, we'll have some time for questions and discussion. You can type your questions out in the chat and I will read them out for you, or you'll be able to raise your hand and we'll call on you to unmute and ask directly. And with that, I'll turn it over to Michelle.
Thank you, Warwick. And thank you for the introduction. I don't have a presentation today, but I would like to start off by also acknowledging that I'm on Treaty 6 territory in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan today. Just a little bit of my background. I didn't have time because I'm very busy already planning for what's looking like it will be quite a crazy flood season. So making a lot of plans and sitting in meetings already preparing for both flood and fire season. I've actually been a volunteer firefighter in my community of Muscadet First Nation. This summer will be 23 years. So with that, I just want to acknowledge that all those years ago, I never ever seen myself as a volunteer firefighter. I was raised, as many of us are in our First Nation communities, to be a helper. In my community, my grandmother actually was always called when we had a death in the community. So she would be the person who helped with all of the food preparations. And my grandmother did that. It was passed down to my mother and then also passed down to myself, and something that I passed down to my daughters as well. So volunteering in my community came naturally. I just never seen myself as a volunteer firefighter. A good friend of mine just shoulder tapped me one day and said, "Hey, Michelle, you should come out to the fire department. I think you'd be great." And I kind of, hooed and hawed about it for a while and went to my first meeting. And the funny thing about it is that most of the members on the fire department at that time, I was related to. So my uncle was the fire chief. Most of my cousins were firefighters. And I still remember, though, that first meeting, walking into the room and, my uncle acknowledging me, "Michelle, welcome to the fire department." And right after he said that, he looked around the room to the boys and said, "Well, boys, we have a female in our fire department now, so everybody's going to have to start shutting the door when they use the washroom." So right from my very first day with the fire department, being singled out like that, it didn't feel good. I didn't feel very welcomed at that time. It was kind of sloughed off as a joke, but it's something that I've never really shook off or forgotten about. So all through those years going through the fire department with my training and responses, I've always felt like I had to do more. I had to train harder. I had to work harder. I needed to show up for every call, not missing anything, right? So, and that was, I think most females feel that way when they join a fire service. But being in the fire service as long as I have, I've really seen a change and a shift. Going from being the only female, watching girls come and go through the years, you really need to make your fire departments more welcoming for females. And I think for females, when they look at fire departments, they always, thinking of the harder jobs of, being able to run the truck and putting, water on the fire. And there's so many other jobs where females could help in the fire service. It's not only one thing you're doing when it comes to fire response on reserve. So a big part of that, when we talk about emergency management on reserve, are volunteer fire departments. So being the first female actually elected to the board of directors was huge for me in my career. I was on the board of directors for 1 year and was actually voted as president the next year. And I'm proud of that because I get to put my voice, everything that I've learned on reserve, and now put that through and forward at the national level. And being a female, I have a different perspective and this passion for females and youth in the fire service and emergency management, which I will talk about to anybody who will listen. In my job as Associate Director for Saskatchewan First Nations Emergency Management, there are two sides to our organization. The organization actually started from years and years and decades actually with the Prince Albert Grand Council, who all of their communities are in the northern boreal forest. And with all of that knowledge, they seen a real gap of having First Nation services in Saskatchewan, reaching out to other organizations and not having the experiences. So the department was formed, and on one side of the operations, we offer firefighting training to all of our First Nation communities on reserve. And we also offer emergency management services as well, and training on both sides. So it's a very busy place. 3 years ago, we also are always adapting. And one thing we started hearing from leadership is a real need for search and rescue. So my team stood up. We were actually the first recognized First Nation search and rescue team involved with SARSAV, which was the provincial body in Saskatchewan. And we went from having no supplies, no materials, except for maybe I think the first 6 months we had backpacks, to now having some of the most sophisticated water recovery equipment in Saskatchewan. So that's a huge part of our operations as well. And everything that we do, I say every day, is always about building capacity on reserve. A community preparedness plan or emergency response plan is only as good as the information that the band has put in it. So I'm always strongly recommending updating plans. Yesterday, I actually sat in a meeting talking to youth from the north. So the Prince Albert Grand Council started a wildfire resilience initiative, which has youth from First Nation communities all over the north. And what they're going to do is interview elders and community members about their experiences during evacuations. So I encourage the youth to actually, since they're all assembled, to open up their emergency response plans on reserve, because those also need the eyes of the youth on them as well, their perspective and their contributions into those plans as well. I think it's a huge gap in our First Nation communities not to involve our youth and make sure that their voices are heard and put into those plans. Over the last 3 years in Saskatchewan, we've seen a huge shift on response on reserve for emergencies. The provincial government in Saskatchewan, what they used to have just a specific branch for emergency management. Last year, they officially amalgamated with the wildfire branch. So it's one huge organization now. It's been a hard transition for our First Nations on reserve. It's changed a lot of the processes for activations, who to call for help. And then a big piece that also changed this year, which was hard for everybody to wrap their heads around and really understand what was going on, is usually in Saskatchewan, it was the provincial government that would activate the Red Cross for emergencies on reserve. Their negotiations broke down. So right now, the the government and the Red Cross do not have an agreement in Saskatchewan. It was difficult as First Nation tribal councils were standing up and starting to make their own agreements with the Red Cross. So it's a little confusing on reserve now when you have an emergency. Who do you call? Who are you going to work with, right? Having the background I do, I can see the benefits of it. Being able to choose service providers is a huge opportunity. But because of what I do every day and what my team does every day of building capacity on reserve, that's where we want all of the resources and chiefs and bands across Canada. That's what everybody wants, is to recognize the knowledge that's on reserve, recognize the specialties, our equipment, and being able to utilize those during an emergencies is so important. Everybody in Canada, I think, acknowledges and knows that emergencies are expensive. The province makes lots of money off of our evacuations, our emergencies. The Red Cross makes money. And if we could keep that at the band level and be able to take on more responsibilities, our evacuations would look so much different. I've been through so many evacuations where the knowledge is just pushed aside, right? And it's starting to change, and it really does go back to the real need to having a good plan on reserve and sticking to that plan, and being able to have a big voice when it comes to other bigger organizations coming in and wanting to assume command of your emergencies on reserve. I'll just stop there for a minute. If anybody has any questions, I feel like I can't see, I'm just bringing up the chat here. So as president of the Aboriginal Firefighters Association, one huge piece that I would love to see changed is our volunteer firefighters on reserve having better equipment. And it goes back to the funding formula. I'm not sure if everybody is aware of this, but on reserve, our firefighters are the formula for firefighters, fire departments hasn't changed in 30 years. And as a firefighter, the costs for firefighting anywhere in Canada has probably tripled in the last just 10 years. So it breaks my heart every time I hear a story about on reserve where a fire truck broke down, the firefighters didn't have the proper equipment. And I've actually sat in meetings with fire chiefs here in Saskatchewan, and they ask the question, well, what do they do with all of their money? It was a few years ago, and this is another point, and something else I'm proud of is right now the Aboriginal Firefighters Association of Canada is leading the rollout of the National Indigenous Fire Safety Council. So what that will do is streamline services and programs for First Nation volunteer firefighters across Canada. And I'm very, very proud to be a part of that. I know how hard it is on reserve, finding resources to even do simple things like public education, knowing what's relevant. And then, like I just said, the struggles with being able to find the money to have a proper program on reserve. So it's a very important initiative that will help volunteer firefighters across Canada. I remember it was 4 years ago when we were just talking about the rollout of this program, and my previous boss, we were at the Saskatchewan Association of Fire Chiefs conference, and he went up and he was speaking about the National Indigenous Fire Safety Council and what it's going to look like coming across Canada. And it was there that I started hearing some of the fire chiefs, what do they do with their money? And, why is this and why is that? And, I was pretty new to my position with Sask First Nation Emergency Management, and being a firefighter, I sat there and I was just biting my tongue and getting so upset. So finally, I put my hand up and I acknowledged some of the little, chatter that I was hearing in the room. And I think a lot of people in that room did not know how underfunded our volunteer firefighters on reserve. I had fire chiefs coming up to me after and saying, I'm so sorry, I had no idea. And I guess it comes back to what you don't know. But I know I changed some attitudes that day. And like anything else, you need to use your voice. And I do every time I get a chance, is making sure that people understand the struggles of our volunteer firefighters on reserve. Within our organization, I'm also very proud of being the first organization in Canada to partner up with Firefighters Without Borders. And I struggle with this, and my team struggles with this, but with the partnership, Firefighters Without Borders would usually get donations of firefighting equipment and send it out of country. With this new relationship, we're actually bringing the firefighting equipment to First Nations here in Saskatchewan, which is, a small cost to us, but it's huge for our volunteer fire departments who may not have turnout gear or SCBAs. So I'm part of the program, but as president of AFAC, it's also very frustrating that we even have to take used turnout gear and give it away to our volunteer firefighters. It shouldn't be like that. We shouldn't have to use used equipment. But there's no room in budgets on reserve for those sorts of things. 5 sets of new turnout gear is well over $20,000. It's very far and few between fire departments who can afford that cost. So I'm proud of the program, but we struggle with it, right? Like, our volunteers deserve better. And just recognizing that word, right? Volunteer. Our volunteer firefighters in Saskatchewan, and one of my officers is working very hard on this right now, they don't even have workers' compensation. So if a volunteer firefighter on reserve were to get hurt, there's no compensation. There's nothing for a family after. So there's so many problems. I'm actually hoping to meet nationally before my time as president is done, which is actually going to be soon, as we sort of dim the lights on the Aboriginal Firefighters Association and turn the lights on for the National Indigenous Fire Safety Council. Lots of work is being done. I encourage everybody to look at the website. Lots of resources. If you know of First Nation volunteer fire departments, please share. We've also taken on the National Indigenous reporting system. So what that will do is start reporting fires on reserve again. So there's another thing I'm not sure if people are aware of, that back in 2010, Indigenous Services Canada stopped reporting fire deaths on reserve. So for us as volunteer firefighters, when you're trying to build programs, data is very important. And that's a gap that the National Indigenous Fire Safety Council is going to close, is being able to have those and help communities with data again. Sorry, did I see there was a question?
Yeah, Simon's got his hand up. Simon?
Hi, Michelle. Good to see you again. Hope you and your family are safe and well. I do have a question, and just taking on your comments about resourcing. Are you in conversations with provincial or federal authorities about the implications of climate change and Indigenous firefighting? I'm particularly thinking on the prairies, but also through BC with their forests and so on. Hotter, drier conditions, everyone is, well, not everyone. The experts are predicting more fires, bigger fires, hotter conditions, less water, more extreme conditions, heat waves, and so on. Are these the sort of conversations provincial and federal authorities are initiating?
I believe there's conversations being had, but like most things, the First Nation voice comes a little after the fact, right? So, and that's always frustrating as well, right? So you have these very top heavy organizations making plans, and then it just rolls down to our First Nation organizations and communities. So I think the best advice would be just what we do every day, is helping communities be prepared. The more prepared you are, I know there's many communities across Saskatchewan preparing for climate change, preparing for not having water to fight your fires. And really that's building resiliency as well, right? And it's frustrating in this day and age of reconciliation. And I admit this, that sometimes when we do get a voice at those higher tables, I don't know how to say this nicely. It's given to check a box on their end, not so much to really acknowledge and honor the voice and the recommendations coming from the person on those committees. So I hope I said that in a nice way, but yeah.
Oh, like most Indigenous peoples around the world, in particular in Canada, you are ridiculously diplomatic and polite. We're going to have to get you down here. You're going to have to learn a few choice words and all that. We'll school you up on that. But no, look, it's fascinating because, again, you know, you're talking primarily a volunteer base. And in communities, people, yeah, they do step up and fill all the gaps. And I have this fear that governments are stepping back from what are their obligations to all their citizens. And of course, we fill the gaps because they're gaps and they need to be filled. And if we're looking at a situation where at what point does the volunteer system collapse because a lack of funding, lack of resourcing, lack of people, and then there's suddenly a particularly bad season or in particular areas, there just aren't the people there. I mean, it's a disaster in the making. We can see it sort of starting to unfold. But anyway, I mean, all something that we can start to work towards addressing, right? Thanks.
For sure.
And I just have a quick question, although you might be going to talk about this, and that's, what is the relationship with the Métis leadership and Métis communities? You know, because oftentimes, especially in the north, that there's a lot of interaction on a daily basis across, but then there's also jurisdictional issues that play in, you know, on and off reserve and that. So is there a close connection with the Métis, or could it be better, or is it just not an issue?
It can always be better. And it's a really great question because I actually seen it firsthand last year, the differences. So we have, and many places in Saskatchewan, you will have a Métis settlement, and right next door, like literally stepping across the line, you're on a First Nation community. And last year we seen an evacuation where this happened, right? And both communities were being evacuated. Well, Indigenous Services Canada was ready to support the First Nation communities, but then the Métis were left to, you know, hands up, I'm sorry, we can't help, right? So actually sat in meetings earlier this year where I heard from Indigenous Services Canada that that's not going to happen this year. And we've come such a long way in the, like, even just the 5 years that I've been doing this job. When I first started, I remember one of my first evacuations, and you know, it was a 4-hour drive from, you know, a remote community to the city center of PA, and they were using school buses, you know, and this was, you know, the provincial government had control of that, right? And, you know, not thinking of it, of course, you're in a panic and everybody, you know, I acknowledge they had to use what they had at the time, but after the fact, it's, you know, hearing stories from the elders and how they were triggered. um, Residential schools, right? And leaving home on a bus, and like there were so many things brought up about just that one part of the emergency, and then having to go 4 hours on a school bus with no washrooms, and people, you know, trying to squeeze in wheelchairs, and you know, I'd like to think, I know I've seen that we've learned from every evacuation that we've had in Saskatchewan over the last 5 years, and changes come after every year, which is really good to see, right? Seeing our people in a huge soccer center, right? And that used to be the norm. You went to congregate shelter is what they were called, right? And everybody's in one great big area for a week or 2 weeks or even longer. And over the last 2 years, now the Red Cross is using hotels, and chiefs across Saskatchewan are saying, we're not going back to congregate shelter, right? Like it's just not going to happen. We will never use buses, school buses again. It will always be, you know, a bus with a washroom. So watching that change has been exciting. Especially when the organizations who are supporting the events are also changing with the recommendations. It took a long time though. You know, you had 10 or 15 years where none of that was happening, right? It was just always the norm and the same. But one thing that's really changed in Saskatchewan too, which has allowed our First Nations to really move forward with emergency management, has been the provincial agreement with Indigenous Services Canada expired a few years ago. So we're in a very weird place in Saskatchewan, not having that agreement signed. I believe they are signing LOUs from year to year. But First Nations have been able to say, hey, you know what? Okay, this is the way it was, right? And this is the way we want it. So the more that our communities, our chiefs, our leadership say, this is how emergencies are going to be run for my community, now is the time, right? And have really good plans to back that up. And then have the volunteers ready and able to stand up. But more important, even to add to that, what my dream in Saskatchewan it would be is a nation to nation approach. So we have tremendous tribal councils here in Saskatchewan, independent bands who, you know, have taken up a lot of emergency response activities, but being able to see First Nations host First Nations, or when they do come to a city center, having First Nation organizations being the first on the ground and helping with the registration and taking care of activities. And we're seeing it slowly unfold and happen. Last year, for the first time, the Prince Albert Grand Council took on the role of transportation for their community members. They did all the booking of the buses, got them up to the communities. When the event was over and it was safe to go home, the tribal council took care of booking all the buses to get everybody home. So slowly and surely, taking on pieces of those that both the provincial government used to hold and the Red Cross, and really taking it and running with it and having a First Nation led response is something I hope to see in my time.
Thanks, Michelle. If you still want to take a couple of questions, I'll ask one. You mentioned earlier about when you first started, and that comment about, you know, having to keep the door closed when the guys are going to the bathroom. I'm just wondering if you can offer us any reflections on if that kind of culture, sort of the masculinity in firefighting, have you seen any changes over time?
I have, like even just within my own department, you know, I think everybody, and I still have many of the same cousins on the department from when I started, and just sticking it out as long as I have, right? That respect comes with that. In the position that I'm in as with Sask First Nation Emergency Management and going out to First Nation communities, and my passion and what I really run with in my office is fire prevention. So visiting communities and talking to children and doing that, I know I've inspired quite a few women in the South to join up and join their volunteer fire departments. And you know, there'll always be criticism, but I don't think it's as bad as what it used to be, because I've spoken to many women who have many more years of service than me, and they've also seen changes. It's been slow. I know it's different in the professional side of the fire service. There still needs to be a lot of change on that arm, where it looks like, and it is, a lot different in the volunteer sector, for sure.
Thank you. And I will pose one more question, and I don't mean to derail you from anything that you were going
Nope.
to be speaking. So I'm not sure if you've been involved in this much, but when Simon was talking about climate change, what that brought to mind was this: what can be done in terms of prevention. So that brings the question about cultural burns. And I'm just wondering if you've heard much in your office or in your time about increasing use of cultural burns as a way to prevent these sort of larger disasters affecting communities.
For myself, I am actually, or was, on the board of directors for Fire Smart. So I'm a huge advocate of Fire Smart in our First Nation communities. That's the first step, right? Is being able to, as a homeowner on reserve, protecting your own property and home, right? And then this is where it gets harder, is because there's no paid positions for volunteer fire departments on reserve to make sure that their whole community is safe. And I advocate for that every chance I get. Is we need more fire chiefs across Canada on reserve should be paid. And then we would have those more resilient communities to fire, because it would be somebody's job to actually make sure that the work was being done. But what happens on reserve is you have the O&M guy who's also the fire chief. You know, it's the second hat that they wear in the community. So the attention is never there for just fire on a day-to-day basis. And that's where we need change. When it comes to climate change and cultural burning in my community on reserve, we do it every spring. But it also goes back to the resources, right? First Nation communities, they're limited to even be able to do cultural burning if you don't have the proper firefighting equipment. You can't just start a fire and not have the resources to stop it, right? If we didn't have a fire truck and our wildland firefighting stuff on reserve, we'd be limited. We wouldn't be able to do cultural burning. You can't just start something and not be able to stop it properly as well. So that's a barrier, I know, for many communities who want to implement cultural burning. In my community, we do it as a way to protect our infrastructure. Really, it's, you know, really doesn't have anything to do with the plant life and, you know, regeneration of species, or we're just specifically trying to protect the school, the water plants, you know, so our burning is very specific on the reserve and what we're doing with that. But like I said, it all goes back to resources and the lack of
Thank you for that. And there's sort of a follow-up question in the chat there. Do you know, does the Assembly of First Nations have a budget line or anything like that to support firefighters in the community or fire
No.
departments? No.
No. The AFN does have an emergency response. I believe it's a director that oversees emergency in his portfolio. But as far as resources, it all goes back to Indigenous Services Canada. So I'm not sure if everybody on the call would know this, but on reserve, there's a funding formula, right, for all of our programs and services on reserve. And this is another thing that I advocate hugely on as well is, first, the funding formula is old, out and outdated. But when it comes to resources on reserve, you know, the formulas haven't changed. And it's not only for fire, it's housing, it's, you know, all these other pieces. It's not realistic. And when it comes to on reserve, and this is my big fight, they recognize that education is important. Education dollars have to be spent on education. Health dollars are important and have to be spent on health, and so on reserve. When it comes to fire protection dollars that they allocate to a band on reserve, it's flex funding. So the First Nation community, when they get their fire protection dollars, can spend that money anywhere they want. It's not specific to fire. So unless you have a real backing like we do on Muscadet from your chief and council, a lot of times our First Nation volunteer fire departments are not even seeing that money. And that's a huge, huge barrier on reserve. So I'm always advocating, you know, you need to change nationally within Indigenous Services Canada, the priority and how important fire protection is on reserve. As an example, my community is roughly 900 people on reserve. I believe our fire department annually gets $40,000 a year. And we have 25 volunteer firefighters. So that pretty much pays to keep the lights on, the heat going. It's supposed to pay for pump tests on our trucks. There's just never enough money. And there's so many things that need to be changed at the top national level within Indigenous Services Canada. I could just go on and on. And yes, you're right, David Diablo with the AFN. I'm just seeing that. Tiffany has a question.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you, Michelle, for bringing up all these issues. Like, just to give you some context, I'm an Indigenous person actually working for the provincial government for BC Wildfire Service. I posted a few links in the chat just with some programs that I know of as far as cultural burning that are being taken on. Again, these are agreements with finesse, local communities, Indigenous communities, as well as the BC, like the provincial government taking on these. He makes such a great point that the funding, like the sustainable funding needs to happen at the very top with ISK. And it's interesting that we just haven't seen this happen yet. You know, we keep coming to these partnership tables every year, and it's the number-one priority is we need capacity. We need to be doing this so that it's not off the side of our desks. And it's starting to happen slowly, but it's really interesting to hear just like from what's happening in Saskatchewan as well, because obviously I have a very small lens just on what's happening in BC. But yeah, I just really wanted to thank you for bringing that important point up.
Oh, thank you, Tiffany. Like I could talk. I was actually at the finesse office, so this was interesting too. So Aboriginal Firefighter Association of Canada got together all of the regional First Nation organizations that lead fire and emergency services across Canada. It's the first time that has ever happened in the history of AFAC, and AFAC is 30 years old. for everybody to sit down at the table and just talk. You know, I don't know why it took so long. We all have different struggles on reserve, and I've been watching BC very closely, and the First Nations are so lucky to have an organization like Finesse, right? But even more important is to have that relationship with the provincial government to help the First Nation communities do things like cultural burning and having, you know, sharing those resources and equipment where, you know, in some provinces, when you reach for a hand, right, a hand up, it turns into a huge bill at the end, which is frustrating and hard on reserve, because even for our emergency events, there's not very much money for preparedness activities. So you could have all the best plans in the world for your community and want to do cultural burning and mitigation, but when it comes to it, the answer is usually no, we don't have the money, right? So, but then an evacuation, a fire comes roaring towards your community and you're having to evacuate, and all of a sudden here's a bunch of money for your evacuation. So it's frustrating that that's another big piece that needs to change as well, right? Is the preparedness dollars need a huge increase for on reserve, because the knowledge is there, the plans are there, but there's just no money to take them on and to get the work done. Does anybody have any more questions? I don't know if I'm missing anything.
Well, Michelle, I'll maybe ask a question. I don't know if I'm so not an expert in this area, but it's around the amount of money that goes into, so buses are rented and there's all kinds of money that's being spent. And oftentimes, I think in the past, although it seems like it's changing, that First Nations people, First Nations communities are not benefiting economically from that, right? So once again, you have First Nations, Métis, other Indigenous, you know, Inuit, as being, as having kind of a whole political economy around suffering, right? Or around tragedy, or around, you know, natural disasters in this case, right? So do you have any opinion about the ways in which, you know, if there's an inevitability around some of this, right? So we're going to have floods, we're going to have fires, we're going to have evacuations, about social enterprise. And you mentioned before Indigenous people looking after Indigenous people and that movement. Is there a business within that, like either a business that's collectively owned by First Nations and then benefits First Nations, or an entrepreneurial aspect of because that's one part of our grant that that we're looking at is you know, First Nations people looking after First Nations people, for instance, and all of the money. And Simon's talked about globally, like the amount of money globally that goes into natural disaster relief and how Indigenous peoples are implicated in that, but not kind of benefiting from a socioeconomic side of it, despite the enormity of resources that go in.
Well, there again, it's the startup and seed money for any First Nation community, right? So you could have the best plans. And I seen it a few years ago here in Saskatchewan, where we had a First Nation community who had a huge arena on reserve. And they wanted to host evacuees who were being sent to, you know, another hour down the highway. And at that time, there was nothing but barriers put in front of their way, right? Well, we have to have a food inspector come in and check your facilities, and no, you can't bring in wild meat. That's not allowed. And, you know, it comes down to provincial policy after, right? even though some of those may not apply on reserve, but just getting the startup money. And that's why my organization is so important in building the capacity. If we can just teach people how to manage their own events. And there's another struggle, right, is First Nation communities who have taken on a lot of those responsibilities, right, who have given their band members all of the fuel to evacuate from their communities with the promise, yes, you're going to get reimbursed from Indigenous Services Canada. Well, 2 months down the road, you're still sending in receipts to Indigenous Services Canada. I know of communities who've went bankrupt waiting for payment back from evacuations. And, you know, it's frustrating for me to know that. So here, it's like a two-tiered system, right? So you have the provincial government and the Red Cross, right, who are supporting with huge bills after an evacuation or an event. They're sending in their GLs, right? And I'm sure payment doesn't take nearly as long as a First Nation community, who are then asked after the event, well, where's the receipt for your $10 gas? Why is there a receipt in here for $5 for food? And I'm not making this up. It happens that the nitpicking on every dollar for every invoice and every receipt is always had on the First Nation side, but it's never had on the provincial side or the Red Cross side. And that needs to change significantly, because communities go into debt every year when they do try and stand up and take control of their own events. And it's very sad. I'm not sure if I answered your question, Carolyn. I kind of went around it, but, you know, and with my organization, that's what we're trying to do, right? Is, you know, even last year, like every event, my organization changes a little bit in what we do, just because of what we're asked to help with, right? So last year we took on a lot of expenses. We had paid for, well, the Prince Albert Grand Council paid for all of the busing, right? That was a huge expense for anybody to hold on to. We were helping with all of the resources provincially were used up for fire protections and sprinklers on reserve, right? So we were helping we actually brought a team from Alberta just to help set up sprinklers in 2 First Nation communities because the province was tapped out. And there's another problem as well, right? If you look at the Provincial Emergency Act, you know, everybody's supposed to be the same, but I've seen it year and year again where you could have a resort community, you know, having the effects of a fire coming towards them the exact same as a First Nation community, but all of the provincial resources are going towards that resort, right? Because they have $1 million cabins, and, you know, people don't recognize our schools, our band office being $1 million buildings as well, right? So another frustration, right? So, but there's never an opportunity for a First Nation community or a tribal council to purchase what's needed to help and save things beforehand. It's usually during an event, right? Which is sad. You shouldn't have to be threatened by fire to be able to buy hoses and pumps to protect your homes.
Right.
That should happen before, right? So it's a very messed up system, to say the least.
Thank you. That gives us a lot to think about. Simon, I'm going to turn it back over to you, I think.
Sure. Oh, kia ora koutou, kia ora Caroline, tēnā koe, Michelle. Many thanks for that. I remember meeting you through a number of others working in the emergency management space in and around, PAGC, also meeting through people at CRHNet, Dr. Lily Yumagalova. I've told people here that Canada's a big country, but a small world. And there's something reassuring about that. And in that small world, you're a big deal. Like, I know, you know, people value humility and humbleness and all that, and you've done that, and it's for other people to talk up your skills and your contribution to your community and communities beyond your community. It's a vital role. and I know you're an inspiration to Indigenous peoples and particularly to Indigenous women. And I fully expect more and more Indigenous girls to be looking at you and the roles that you have played. And then as they grow into adulthood, actually just assume that, yeah, I can run a fire truck, I can run a crew, I can run a nationwide organization protecting our people. I think that's just going to become the norm. And like you say, you start out as a helper at one level and you're just helping at a bigger level, at a scale that now is really, really significant to your people. And here's the classic thing, of course, is that you're actually supporting non-Indigenous peoples as well. That actually you're filling a gap and you're actually providing a service that, yeah, maybe we expect the provincial and federal governments to kick in with stuff, but there's people like you actually volunteer your time and your skills, and you're undervalued and underpaid, but actually you're going to get some reward for that along the way. And I know you do. I know you feel it. I know you feel it. I know you feel it. And I just wanted to articulate that and put that out there in this group. Kia ora koutou, that's 8 a.m. It's been 60 minutes. Everyone's time is valuable. We won't ask any more of it for you. I see that there's been some chat there and there'll be some exchange of links and so on. It's recorded. This becomes part of the resources that we're hoping to accumulate in the grant that we're on at the moment. And absolutely looking forward to meeting people face to face soon. And Caroline and I have talked about ways that we can actually start bringing people together for, I mean, yeah, knowledge exchange, but yeah, just to hang out and enjoy each other's company. And there is a plan to bring people like Michelle, and there are several others at PAGC that I've kind of semi-promised to bring down to New Zealand for a trip. And it's, the more I say it, the more it's going to happen, right? So I'll say it there again, and it's absolutely got a professional reason that we have not been as, we have not had to have been as aware of wildfires in our communities because it's, we generally certainly haven't had the scale that North America and Australia have. But it's hotter, it's drier. The models are starting to come true, and we now have regular grass fires. We are more likely to have bushfires. Our communities, a lot of the cultural assets, the buildings, the ancestral houses, they're made of wood. They often don't have fire alarms, or if they do, they're not maintained. Fire brigades are often volunteer, but they could still be 30, 40 minutes away. Huge risk to the things that we value, and we need to have the expertise that's in your head, Michelle. We'll get you and your teams down here, and we'll actually just start picking those brains and try and, same thing, build up resources, capacity and resilience, because it's what our communities deserve.
Yeah. And I see Jenny Gardapi and Holly Graham both had their cameras on, so they may have questions. So I'll just check in with them to see if they do, because they're both here, which are very close colleagues of ours. And yeah.
Hi, Michelle. Can you hear me?
I can. Hello.
Okay. Hi. I was just wondering about the Res Cross.
Yeah.
Was there any like best practices or any documents or reports regarding that?
I don't believe any reports came out of that. I can reach out to a friend though, who was a big part of that. Yeah, there was lots of lessons learned though, right? But we have to acknowledge that every time we build capacity on reserves, the organizations who have been in care and control of those services for years and years and years, they don't want to let go of that, right? So whenever we stand up and we start organizing and we start taking care of ourselves, it's very scary for the government, the Red Cross, whoever it may be, to be taking money out of their pockets, right? Like, we have to admit, emergencies on reserve is a big business for these organizations. So, but I encourage it all the time. It's like, you know, if you can take care of this piece of an evacuation or that piece, then we should be doing that as First Nations people and really taking care of each other, because at the end of the day, it'll be less traumatic on our people, right? And that's always the goal, is healthier band members as well.
Yeah. Thank you. I was a health
You're
director
welcome.
at that time. So We
Oh, were
are
you?
from Beardy's, yeah.
Yes,
So
yeah,
we were a big
yeah.
part of
I
that.
know Kevin. Yeah, I know
Yeah.
Kevin actually just called me the other day about doing a presentation. Yeah.
Aw, yes,
So
yeah. It was
yeah.
it was very hard on everybody, but at the same time, it was something that our community felt like they needed to do.
Mm-hmm. And people still talk about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it made a huge impact for
Yeah.
sure.
And there's a link to a thesis that Warwick has put up on, I'm not sure, Warwick, who's the student? Which thesis was that?
It's a student, Sandra Betancourt Vega. And the thesis was written in 2019 or finished in 2019. And I think it was working under James Waldron, Dr. Jim Waldron.
Yeah. And Holly, did you have a question?
Awesome.
Good to see you.
I was just gonna say, just in general, when we start taking care of ourselves as First Nations people, it is very scary for everyone around us because we're big business, whether it's the health industry, social, child, like it's just, we are the economy, the backbone of this
Yeah.
country. And for us to get well is not in their best interest.
No. And I've watched huge pushbacks, right? Like it was unreal to watch the provincial government and in meetings fight with the Red Cross. Like literally, so in Saskatchewan, I've seen the provincial government now this year wanting to take on all the roles and responsibilities of the Red Cross. Like, what would that look like for our people with the past relationship we've had with the government during our emergencies, right? It's scary to say the least. But like you said, it comes down to money, right? It's a fight for our money and our services right now.
So Warwick, back to you.
All right. So just as we wrap up here, a couple of notices. Well, first, thank you to Michelle and thank you, Michelle, for joining us today and sharing your experiences. Thank you to everyone for your questions and for participating. Another thank you to our funders, the TD Bank Group, and to Allison for her help today. I will be emailing out a short survey about today's presentation, mostly just to get feedback on how you feel it went. Just a quick note on our next webinar, we may be changing the date. Usually we've been holding it on Fridays for the last two webinars. We might change it to Thursday. We're not quite sure on our availability for the presenter yet, but just check our Facebook or Eventbrite or our website for updates on when it will be. We'll keep an eye on your email. I'll send out a notice through Eventbrite. Other than that, thank you everyone for joining, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks,
Have
everybody.
a great day.
Thanks so
Thanks,
much,
Michelle.
Michelle. Thank you very, very, that was
Oh,
excellent.
you're welcome.
No, it was
Next time, if I ever have to do this again, I will work on a presentation, I promise.
No,
Well, this-
I just